Out of that tradition of handbooks for giving sermons, a tradition developed which would dominate 16th and 17th century European learning, that of what are called commonplace books. And these were books where people, well, the students and the teachers, what they did was they were given a book with certain headings and subheadings, alphabetically or ordered according to different schemes. For instance, some of the headings were the cardinal virtues and sins, and then subheadings which were often phrases like, should the philosopher get married, is one of the typical subheadings which is found in these books, or certain biblical statements about gluttony or abstinence. And the quotations taken both from the Bible, from the church fathers, later theologians, and from the ancient philosophers were ordered and modified according to these headings and subheadings. Now what you see there is how the steps of commonplacing and clustering actually played out in European history. Because this is what happened. Their theological ideas, or clusters of such ideas, were made available, commonplace, in these books, and then brought together so that their mutual relationships could be discovered or decided upon. Right? Some of the theories or notions from, say, Aristotle or Plato or Cicero were modified or cut and pasted into these books so that they became coherent, consistent, compatible with basic Christian theological ideas. And most of the time it is very obvious that there is a clear ranking of authority in these books, where the Bible came first as God's revelation of His will, then certain church fathers as a second level of authority, then other theologians, Aquinas, and so on. And only then could pagan philosophers be included, only to illustrate some of these theological truths. Now, one of these truths had become that all work is vocation, all occupation is vocation, and work is the worship of God. We're all equal before God. And these were combined with, say, ideas from the Stoics. The Stoics often said that leisure without work or without study makes your mind dull and makes you become an empty shell of a man or woman. So these were taken and combined with the notion that we should all work because God has called us to do so, and this is a way of worshipping Him, and all this work is equal. In this way, clusters of commonplace ideas came into being and were spread through the schools, because these commonplace books in the 16th and 17th century were used in several kinds of schools, both by the humanists, the Protestants, and the Jesuits, the Counter-Reformation. They used an entire method of learning how you should order quotations and how you could combine different clusters of ideas to develop new discourse and give speeches and write texts. So in this way, commonplace books around Europe taught the Protestant believer how to live and how to treat other human beings within the framework of the theological notion that all human beings are equal. And they began to create a European common sense about what human beings are like and how they should be treated. Now, in the late 17th and early 18th century, the commonplace books lose their popularity. Suddenly there's a decline, and the words used for commonplace, like logikomenes, or even in the vernaculars, commonplace, cliché, get a very negative connotation. They become truisms which everyone knows and which are not worth repeating, which are boring in some sense. And that's when the step of secular theorizing kicks in. Because what has happened there is one no longer realizes that these are very specific theological ideas belonging to a particular religion. They are now seen as obvious truths about the world. Of course, all human beings are equal. Of course, all occupations are vocations. This has now become so obvious, it doesn't require repetition. It's as though structure of common sense had been conflated with the structure of the social world. And like saying human beings have 2 legs and 2 arms and 2 eyes, or at least most of them. A step of secular theorizing begins to use these commonplaces, or clusters of commonplaces, combine and recombine them, and develop new theories. And in case of equality, the best example I can think of is that of John Locke, who really takes some of these basic Protestant ideas and recombines them. He says that all human beings are equal, therefore government should always be by consent or with consent of the governed. If you ask, there's a book by Jeremy Waldron, within the framework of our research program, it's a very striking analysis of Locke's work. It's called Locke, God and Equality. He shows that when you ask the question to Locke, why, in what sense are all human beings equal? What is the foundation of equality? Locke will say, well, we all share a property in common as a species property, reason. You might think reason, he means the way we talk about reasonableness, trying to make things coherent, compatible, so that fairly coherent wholes come into being, or clusters come into being. But he doesn't mean that. What he means by reason is the capacity to recognize, to see that the world embodies God's reason, God's plan. That everything that happens around us, in our lives, in nature, is an expression of the will of God. And that we have the capacity to search for our own place within that plan. So only those human beings have reason who have this capacity. Basically that means only Muslims, Christians and Jews have reason if you pursue this idea. But that's what John Locke means by reason, and that's why we're all equal. So there you see how these theological clusters are still very explicitly present in some kind of Protestant theological form. Now, we could say that from the permutation of these commonplaces, modern philosophy was born in Europe. And it's not only theories about equality, but about religion, and the idea that all human beings have religion in some form and that there's natural religion. This developed notions about freedom, about the nature of our psychology. Well, I just want to end my presentation to talk about the link between all of this and the development of Orientalism and the European colonial descriptions of India. See, by the time the Europeans came to India, common sense, the Western Christian common sense, had already crystallized to a large extent. In 16th, 17th century, late 17th century especially, this had already crystallized. And when they came to India and tried to make sense of the culture and society they encountered, they wrote about their experience. They wrote travel reports, missionary reports, colonial official documents, talking about the Indian people, Indian society. And all kinds of ideas were developed there, or all kinds of impressions. For instance, there's a very interesting document from the late 18th, early 19th century, a circular which was sent around by the East India Company in Bengal, asking all its officials in all the different districts of Bengal to report about the morality of the inhabitants of their district. And the second question was, do you think that the introduction of East India Company structures and new courts and development of these courts has improved their morality or not? They find all kinds of answers. Of course, the common answer that is most often repeated is they're all immoral and perjury this and lying that, and we cannot do anything about it, even our courts don't work. But there are dissenting voices, and quite a few of them, which say that, well, when I first came here, population was very moral and they were extremely generous and they always helped each other and this and that. But then when we started introducing these new structures, they had a negative effect. People started committing perjury because they were called as witnesses in courts. And so these dissenting voices were filtered out once the reports reached Europe, because the new information about India had to be made consistent and coherent and compatible with the clusters of commonplace ideas and topoi, because that's what they become once they're developed into so-called secular theories. This information had to be compatible and had to be digested so that it would fit in. And the most obvious way of doing that was to say that, look, Christianity and Western culture embodies certain values, namely equality, freedom, toleration. False religion, according to the Protestants, embodies the negation of these values. That remained the same. Even according to so-called secular colonial officials, Indian culture embodied the negation of these values of equality, liberty, and these commonplace or these normative topoi. And around this, the descriptions of so-called Hinduism and the caste system were developed. And they were repeated and combined. In a later step, they were combined so that new theories about how the caste system had developed, Aryan invasion theory, for instance, were developed out of these new topoi about India. Of course, then it became very easy to say, well, what you should now do is follow the virtues of the West, values like equality, liberty. And there are two poles in the understanding of India. On the one hand, Indian culture or certain traditions within Indian culture could be understood as negations of these normative topoi, and that's Hinduism and the caste system. Others could be understood as attempts to also pursue these normative topoi or values, namely Buddhism, Bhakti, and the Lingayats, for instance. And this is what is still repeated to this day. And when you see Swami Vivekananda talk about the gospel of equality, it's because these descriptions have become so familiar, have become the way of looking at Indian society. When you see the Lingayats say that work is worship, it's because of the same reason. Of course, the question there is, and I won't say much about this, Balu will explain, when I finish my presentation, he'll explain the theoretical framework behind this. I won't go into that. But of course, when Indians adopted these notions, these topoi from the West, like equality or the dignity of labor or workers' worship, they interpreted them in completely different ways. They actually distorted them because they understood them in terms of commonplace ideas and topoi that were already available in Indian society. Professor Shiv Ramakrishnan told me yesterday that this work is worship is a translation of a sentence found in Basaveshwara's writings, which amounts to... Yeah. So it's understood in this way, which of course does not convey the meaning it has in Protestantism or in Christianity, work is worship. It's distorted. The original sense of what Basava meant is no longer available because it's now translated as work is worship, and no one means what makes work into worship and what worship is. Does that mean when I'm driving my rickshaw I'm doing puja? No, I'm not, because it's difficult to do the two at the same time. So what we're now looking into in our research program is how these topoi were distorted by mapping them onto commonplace ideas already available in Indian vernacular languages and in Indian traditions. And the best way to do so is studying the distortions that have taken place when they were appropriated in India, because these distortions tell us something about the structure of the commonplace ideas and the practices present in Indian culture. So I'll end there, and Balu will explain the theoretical framework behind this presentation. Thank you.